totally good.
So is Chris Benson presenting on June 24th, 2014 for controls, general and on the Siemens system?
Yeah. The big thing, the two big things we're going to cover, and I could spend a whole day on these, are trends in the Siemens system and zonal scheduling. And several points, Dave, that you had forwarded me that Glenn had requested about verifying that things are set up, some known pitfalls that I know the office has gone through, and just ideas about understanding how things are set up. I think it's really helpful background knowledge. Perfect. First of all, the very first thing I put in here for trends, let's start with that. We're going to take the first hour, cover trends, how you could lead this session. Well, I think that'll actually be really good that hopefully we can go through some of the things we talked about a few weeks ago, and if we go over any specific concepts that have still been a pain point, hopefully we can address those or reinforce the thoughts. But at the very beginning here, I have some, for the notes that I provided, I've got some resources, best resources that I thought would be helpful. So those is, you're familiar with the trend status template worksheet. Within there, not only is a place to track your trends, but there's also some instructions for how to set up trends in a Siemens system. That's a resource. Jim and Tom have been aware that was available fairly recently, so I think that's about a year old. But the pictures, it's not nearly as much text, so it's a lot easier to read.
I will say something there, Jim, is I've asked him, I tasked him to work on that training. With, and unfortunately, it might be an NCMC, and I can to move that out of there into that universal one. But he's been doing a lot of trend work, much more than me. I felt it was necessary to get him to add some more notes to it. It was pretty good for sure. Bad things I didn't know it was there. You were in and didn't really know there was Siemens.
I showed it to him. Did he show it to you, or did you just find it?
No, the communication around here might not be the right hand telling the left hand unless we're not making money. About it.
Sure.
Well, anyway, it's a really good resource.
And I need to get it into everybody. If you're going to work on it, let's make sure we talk to Jim and pick his brain in CMC.
What bring it up? Can someone navigate to find that file?
Yeah, I can help too.
And while that's coming up,
are you saying you want to find them more recent?
let's bring in the status worksheet.
Yeah, sure.
But you don't want to bring up the one that's been.
The progress that hasn't been shared yet.
I think that's correct. That's the correct analogy.
First thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of references. And I recommend not just adding content, but taking out stuff that doesn't apply anymore.
That's what I asked them to do. We both put our brain dumps into it after we met with you, but he's been doing a lot more work in it than me, and I tasked him with it. It was like, listen, let's make this our own. Because we didn't know it was there. Anyways, I'm not going to sidetrack anymore. You're good.
Okay. So here we've got instructions, standard measure points, we can apply to everything. And then the really important thing that we're talking about specific to Siemens is this Siemens trend setup tab. Lots of screenshots, lots of notes. I went through this, everything looked really valuable. I personally recommend looking at as the quickest reference.
We didn't know that was there when we were looking at the Word document.
Oh,
I had no idea there was something in there on Siemens.
Okay.
So let's bring up that Word document though, because that's also got some things that aren't in here. There's guidance on memory, assessing memory.
We did use that, by the way, from that Word document. I had Jim do that.
Cool.
So we're just blindly setting up trends on panels. I made him follow that, and he found it very easy to follow. By using this one that she's going to.
It is really good, I think, if we.
Yeah. So this is called creating and collecting trends.
Say creating.
Creating and collecting trends.
Yep.
Whoa.
Yep.
Okay.
Again, this one isn't as readable, but there's content that's not in the summarized graphical training. So out here, hopefully they'll be consolidated soon. But if it did, I wanted to bring up a picture from here. And finally, you can go straight to the source. So the Insight User Guide, it's not a great read either, but it's a great reference. So there is some really helpful content in there if anything isn't clear for you. That's usually my last reference, if we hadn't figured out something ourselves. I did want to talk just real quickly about identifying points to be trended. Oh, and it looks like I copied this in the wrong section, but so, the reason bringing this up is that obviously if we're setting up trends, you have to know what you're setting up trends on, and that's not always clearly communicated. So just a few points that I thought were good to reiterate or talk about that haven't been documented. I recommend, first of all, if you don't know what points to trend are available, first look at the graphics. So the graphics for a control system for a particular equipment, like an air handling unit, it's a really good summary for the equipment that's there and some of the points that are available. But it's not foolproof. Some of it they chose not to put them on the graphics. Sometimes they misrepresent where things are, aren't aware of components. So I'd say 85, 90% true in general. They might have linked to the wrong point again. But it's a really easy way to get a list of points and understand the system. Within the trend status worksheet too, at the very first tab, standard measure points, the second tab, there are some reminders for points that are really valuable for different types of equipment. So air handling units, in particular at the very top, are those sought after points to find. And guidance about how to identify what it is. Well, it might be an input, it might be an analog point. Hopefully we'll get engineering units that are easy to calculate with or easy to make sense of. So something like a percent is a lot easier to integrate than PSI or volts. Just as we're looking at this list, if you're selecting trends, inputs, analog inputs, binary inputs, multi-state inputs, those are generally best for identifying actual operation for sensed values. For instance, if you want to know what the speed of VFD is, an input is a way to know you're getting feedback from the drive, what it's running at, not just what the control system is telling it to do. There's always an opportunity for something to be manually overridden or bypassed. Now, the only exception to that, though, is if the engineering units are non-intuitive. So, if the actual output's PSI, I recommend trending it. Not very helpful. So, I'll be able to go one step back and say that there's a value that gets turned into PSI that's a percent. That would be a better target. Output, so analog out, binary out, multi-state out. Actually, I don't know if that's really a thing. The multi-state line. They generally be best for controlled dampers and valves. So sometimes you can get feedback from those, but they tend not to be set up as reliably. They're a good indication for how system's probably controlled. The virtual or values, as they're termed in BACnet, those are good for verifying set points. Also modes and calculated points. So is the handling unit occupied, unoccupied? Is the VD box in a cooling or heating mode? Those are values, they're not a true input or output. So a really good guide though when you're trying to find points, narrow down which one is which and what's valuable. If you find an ETC point name that matches up one of these, it's probably not very valuable or unique. So that's a guide that's something to consider trending. That being said, I'm sure there are more that need to be created, but again, a good rule of thumb. Lastly, a real quick note, terminal unit trends add up really fast. So if you have 50 boxes and each of those has 10 trends, now you're talking about 500 trends. That could take up a lot of memory, it's a lot of network traffic. So when you terminal equipment, be really careful about how much you really think you need. And things like sampling. So just do 10% of the boxes or 20% of the boxes with a large number of points, or selection of points on all the boxes. Okay, so let's talk about panel memory. Siemens in particular, we talked about this a little bit in our first training session. Siemens in particular has had some known problems for panel memory when you're looking to set up trends. So first thing that I'd recommend is look at the primary controllers, that's where trends live, and see them have low memory. So then you can go, there's a program, one of those apps called System Profile, and you can click on each one, very quickly go through and figure out if any have low memory. None of them have low memory, there's a bunch of steps you can skip. So that's the thing. If you have low memory, you have to be really careful moving forward with trends. It means that suddenly you have to consider how much memory you're going to take up. You have to make sure that you don't have so much memory that the program stops functioning or the panel stops communicating. I emphasize that enough. It is an important step to take. It's really tempting to skip that, but it doesn't take much time, and it's well worthwhile.
And the limit for when you say low memory, I think this document is still a good reference for trying to understand what limits you should be comparing for.
I agree, and I'm sure if those made their way into the trend status template.
I don't know that they have, no.
There's a couple guides. One is if the primary panel, if the memory is less than 500 kilobytes, or half meg, warnings are suddenly we're in dangerous territory. Another, and that's explained, but on Siemens panels, there's two different types of memory that matter. One's the total available memory, the contiguous block. That means,
This is written wrong. It's contiguous, and someone wrote continuous.
yeah, contiguous. How much of that memory is in a big chunk that you can take advantage of? If I do that out real quick, you could have, it's not worth much time, but if I had memory occupied like this, and I had a chunk that was this big, this was my whole available memory, I suddenly can't fit that in, right? And so it's usable if it's not contiguous or together.
500 kilobytes is not much. Are we really running on that?
Yes, they're so bad.
Yeah.
Antiquated.
So a lot of older systems, the newer systems don't deal with that very often. Most new panels are dealing with something like 50 megabytes, and they only eat up a couple megabytes. So they're fine. The lowest I typically see those is get to like 30 megabytes. You don't even have to blink.
Yeah.
Just move forward. But like McKay had this, I think Dixie River Road had this, and I think Kaja might have had this. There were different places that we dealt with that we really run into this limit. He had one panel that was low.
It just causes a problem yesterday that why it wouldn't write its VAV. We found after weeks of messing with them, it was so low it couldn't run the VAV scheduling. So he swore up and down it was working, and then I said, test it. So it crashed the panel.
Interesting.
Stop the program.
Yeah. So
Tricky.
Yeah. So
And real.
yeah, it's very real. So step, just look at all the panels. Again, if any of them are low, now we've got to do a couple extra steps. So some steps are run in summary report to identify what trends exist. So the reason you're doing this is you may want to have a discussion with the facility about what can you get rid of. You could clear up some available memory. But that's not an easy process. So FIS might have to log trends for humidity requirements, for instance, in an OR, make sure that they're meeting standards and qualify for insurance reimbursement, things like that. You can't just delete trends willy-nilly, and obviously they'd get mad if they had something that wasn't working for them too. Having that discussion can actually be a real challenge. So generate a list, talk about what you want to get rid of, what the required frequency is, do they still have a report that's set up to collect that and trend that. And avoid that, it's a lot of trouble for not a lot of gain. You're just freeing up memory. Maybe a bit of improvement of speed. The thing you may want to do is to estimate new memory requirements. So we touched on this really briefly in the first session. There's a trend memory estimator from Siemens. You have, I think again, this document has a good guide right here. Analog trends at this interval in 2 stage storage is about 50 kilobytes. So you see, it doesn't really take that many trends to get that 500 kilobytes quite low. And it's especially true when you have DAVs attached to these panels. Let's see. So things that you can do, if you had this discussion, are removing trends with intervals that are less than 15 minutes. So oftentimes people, whether it's the facility or the people when they set up the original system, they don't think a lot about what's necessary. And so you often see interval trends that are set up at 1 minute per minute. And that's for really silly things. So out there at 1 minute. Well, air temp really doesn't change that fast. And it would be silly to do 1 minute intervals. You're just wasting memory. That opportunity, if you need to reduce that, if it's really 1 minute and you really think you only need 15 minutes, potentially you can cut the amount of memory that took by 15 times. So that might be a good way to reduce it. Sometimes there are redundant trends set up on a point. So not only do I have the COV, but I have an interval of 15 minutes and I have an interval of an hour. Well, the interval hour is overlapping with 15 minutes. You don't need both. So I might be able to delete one of those. And as we were just talking about, if you are in a territory where you have low trends, you do make some changes, add new trends, eat up some of that memory. It's go back and verify correct operation. So normally what we used to do was to look the day after. Right after we make the change, make sure that if we go to graphics, that nothing backs out, that you actually see things communicating. Also come back a little while later and make sure that there isn't any evidence of problems. I have to work with the facility too and say, we have a risk of this, we believe we've done what we need to. Let us know if you experience any problems and we can cut those trends back or delete other trends, be a little more selective. Okay, so let's move on to the 3 parts of Siemens apogee trends. So there's a great graphic on here that Jane drew like 5 or 6 years ago.
It's so good.
Oh, you
It's so good. That's it. And it's my favorite sketch ever.
Okay. So in the very first session, we talked about network structure, right? We did already talk a little bit about this, but I wanted to reemphasize this for Siemens. I have three steps for setting up a trend. One is you need the primary control panel. You need to have the trend set up there. This is what actually saves the memory, saves the value for these points. And you have limited memory here. So you only want to store a couple days tops. You use that under the server because there's a lot more memory. It's a little bit more accessible, easy to get to. So one of the processes that needs to happen is you need to set up a trend collection. It gets it off every panel, puts it on the server, and allows you to store more data on that computer. And there's a step that really applies more to you than the facility. The facility doesn't care about this one at all. You may extract that data. You may want to bring it into SkySpark. You may want to do calculations on it, whether that's in TDM, elsewhere, doesn't matter. But in order to get it out of this server, you have to run an additional report, and this one's called trend data detail. So this is what allows you to save it in a CSV. So there's several important considerations for each of these. Let's talk about the setup trends first. So, how many have ever seen setup trends? I guess. Jay, it looks like you might have.
Maybe.
I think you have.
Yeah, I think I have a little bit. I don't think anything big. Yeah.
So, any of you done a system that didn't have a trend wizard?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Y'all very trend wizardy, is it?
So, a trend wizard
Yeah, yeah.
Wizard is, we're not gonna go to Niagara, but Trend is a newer feature. It's a way to deal with trends in bulk. Okay, it's a really nice feature. What doesn't have it means you have to set up every trend one by one. There really are a lot of sites where we've set up 1,000 trends. That can take a lot of time.
So it's like, so for VAV box, for instance, you have to go to every box and set up the trend.
Every point on every box.
Wow, for sure.
But you have to expose the point.
Yeah.
But to not distract, let's focus on Siemens. Because this really is unique. A lot of the things about the trends here, they don't apply to other systems. And it's more complicated. There's more here than you have to deal with for other sites, for other types of control systems. Still have a wizard. Most systems do, but you occasionally run into one without. I assume for now that you will have a wizard, so we don't go down a path talking about something that's just going to waste your time. But if you encounter this without a wizard, go to April or Todd. So if you have a wizard, you can set up trends for a large number of points at once. In that process of reserve memory on that primary panel and starting to collect it. So it'll just repeat the same 96 or 200 samples. Once it gets to the bottom, it starts up at the top. So you always have 200 samples. So if you have, off the top of your head, how many samples do you need for 15-minute intervals for a full day? Who can answer first?
A minute?
So 15-minute intervals, how many samples do you need to equal a whole
I have to use my calculator.
96?
96, yeah. So if you want just one day on a panel, you have to have at least 96 samples. That's only if it's 15-minute intervals, okay? And the reason I'm emphasizing this is the numbers change if your interval changes. If you have hour samples, how many do you need for a day? 24. A little easier. If your goal is to store a certain amount of samples, for instance, an amount of time, they need to coordinate the interval with the samples. Like that. What was really recommended is 200 samples, because typically you're doing 50-minute interval trends, and that's just over 2 days. The nice thing about having just over 2 days is that if you collect daily and you collect the day after, then there's still enough for that whole day before. And lose the opportunity to collect it, and you come back, you still have 2 days. So 200 number comes from, and they refer to that, again, if we come back to
We go back to
that chart.
this document?
Yep. So here we got panel buffer size of the panel samples desired. Again, the recommendation is 200 here. So that means 2 days on this, right? Next we got collection. There's one more thing when you set up a trend that's really important. So there's buffer memory. And the buffer memory, you don't worry about the term so much as but you do need to set this up. It's the amount of time that collected trends will remain on the server. I'm saying that because if you don't collect the trends, it's irrelevant. Okay, so I mean that you get it on here, and there's still a limit here that says, instead of 6 samples that starts at the top, I'm now going to have a window of time and expire trends. It doesn't continue and get forever big. So normally this would be set to something like 30 days. Has a lot of memory. A month is usually a good amount of time. If you come back every week or two, if you miss something, you can go back and get that at the last stage. It's really for the facility to look back at several weeks of performance and see how things are really going.
Requires 3 months.
Well, so here's the difference, though. So you don't necessarily need that available on the server. So if you have that available for the facility for easy reference, then that's a place to do it. And you can do 90 days or 93 days, whatever. But you access the trends if you export. So for your purposes, if you need to verify something for 90 days, then this is irrelevant, as long as you get the data out.
So I remember in the last training, the Siemens, you can set up trends in the control system to expire. So they're still in the system, but they stop actually recording and taking all the memory out.
You can, good memory. You can schedule the reports to expire. And one of the reports is the collection. The trends still exist here.
Okay.
Still have memory occupied. But you can stop it from bringing it back onto the server, and you can stop it from exporting into the CSV. Yeah, good point. Anything you bring on that server, you can view in dynamic plotter. So, remember what dynamic plotter is. Yeah.
It basically plots the trends within Siemens as they occur.
Okay. Okay, so you're close. So that's one of the things it can do. An app in Siemens, in a Siemens Apogee system, and there's two things you can do. One is you can look at historical trends, what I'm referring to, and the other you can look at actual performance and start viewing, basically collecting that over time without setting up trends. So functional test, that's where that dynamic plot without trends makes sense. And if you go back and see what made its way into the server, great tool. This is what the facility uses when they're reviewing trends. It tells you what's in the server. Okay, let's talk about creating and scheduling that trend report. So if you have a wizard, it's part of that wizard process they were thinking. So not only do you have an opportunity to set up trends, to define that panel count, to define the buffer memory size, but you can set a report you want to run and you can schedule it all from this wizard. So a few important notes about here. In the past, ETC had created individual collection reports every time we set up trends. It ended up being hard to manage. A few things that might be helpful are be sure to put ETC in the name for any report that you create. You know that it's your decision if you want to make a change or delete it. Another recommend is just have one trend collection report. If you come to a site and there's already one, just add to it. For the most part, there are no limits on the trend collection side, although you may still want to break it apart again for maintenance. But you can add to as few as possible, and some reference to ETC, so it's easy to know it's yours. Already mentioned, I'd recommend running this every day, so that you really limit the amount of memory you're taking in here. You set that to a relative time range relative to when you schedule this report. So we got that a little bit in our first, that was last session for Report Builder. If I set report, I could either say I want it to go from 14th, 1981 to November 14th, 1994, to a specific date range, or I do a relative date range. A relative date range is like last 7 days, last 24 hours, last month. The one that usually is helpful is yesterday. Yesterday, what do you think that means?
The day before the report got pulled, or?
You're right. So it is the day before, but where do you think the hours would fall? So last 24 hours, is it midnight to midnight the day before? Yeah, that's right. There's a different option for the last 24 hours. So yesterday, the nice thing about this is if you run the report at 2 a.m., you run the report at 4 a.m., it doesn't matter. You still get midnight to midnight. because you had 2 days collected on that, when you run it at 4 a.m., you have a full set of data from midnight to midnight the day before. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the last step. So creating and scheduling trend detail report. Unfortunately, this one didn't make it into the wizard. So no matter what, there's an extra step you have to add. That's a little harder. So you have to go to Report Builder, which is that app with access to 1,000 different types of reports. You have to create a new trend data detail report or add it to an existing one. And you have to add all the points that you just set up here. You at least have to select them, each, or a range of points. That's a step that often gets missed. So it's really easy to go through and set up those trends, collect them, have not end up in the CSV file. It's really easy to not select all the points that were set up through this process. Something that's important to come back to and double check to verify. This report is also challenged that if it's too big, it'll fail. So in general, if you can limit to one file, again, it's easier to manage. Still recommend that ATC. But if you're doing more than 1,000 trends, you probably need to break it up into more than one. With 1,000 trends, we saw them start to crash. And that means that I believe you didn't get any of the trends, if I'm not mistaken. So for instance, for a big campus, you may want to break it into report per building. Or you may break it into measure. So they deal with VAV boxes versus air handling units, maybe one for each other. Or maybe in a phase, and a 2014 project, but you know you're going to do a 2015 project, create a new different. Another consideration for this where yesterday matters, and collection is just going to take everything off the panel. And this file, this is the report that you have to designate whether it's to a file or not, what names that file, where it lives, how it formats the data. Okay, so really important things to know. First of all, the location. So, Todd, do you remember where you run a report manually? Where does it save?
I think it's default to screen, and then if you select a file, then you can dig down and I think that's what you're asking. I think you open it up and you select it, you don't do anything else. If you hit run, it'll just do it on screen. It won't put it in directory. Then you have to do export option and then configure it to comma limited, and then select the path where you're going to put it.
Nice. Yeah.
I think that's what it did for me last night when I was.
Yeah. So good memory.
Yeah.
So you have an option to print to screen. The print to screen just means you're going to see it. It doesn't get saved to a file on its own. But you can still add and export it. You can still do it manually at any time. Choose to save it to a file. Run it manually. It's relative to the computer you're running it from. So C drive, ETC reports, and I'm going to call it test 1.
2014-06-23 test 1.
There you go.
I'm trying to.
So if I run that report manually, it's on the workstation or wherever I run this from. That, if you run it through a scheduler, it's on server. Period. So whenever you select these from a scheduled report, you have to get it on the server or you're not going to play it.
That was our biggest problem at MC.
So another important thing is you can tell it to create a directory, to file it in a directory that doesn't exist. But as smart as other programs, you have to make sure that folder exists before you save it. Otherwise it won't create. Yep.
Maybe you said this, and maybe I just missed it, but I just want to clarify. Sometimes the workstation can multiple workstations, and sometimes not the server, and if everybody understood that. But
yeah, good point.
But sometimes, we log in maybe remotely, and it's, some guy's computer in the shop. It may not be the server, I guess, and that's the point that Chris is making, is that you not be on the computer where the trends are being saved.
That's a great point. So, we're on the schematics, and maybe we could bring up this, PowerPoint, let's talk about it real quick. Remember the network schematic, it's your primary network, and we'll get all these primary panels. Sometimes that's an IP network. That means on the same network as regular computers, right? And those can access the system directly if they have software installed on them. But something separate, and it's a little different. So it's not just access to the system, it's where a lot of the backup resides. Things like trends, programs, when you have lots of power, they feed back from the server. Usually this is a dedicated computer in like a fire safety room or something, or in a central plant. And people aren't always aware of which one's which. They might just access the system and they don't know which one's the server. It's really important to know that you're on the server when you're setting up this trend, that you know that folder exists, and you know where to go to collect it. Do you think that covered it well enough?
Yeah. Yeah, great.
Okay, so another important thing with these files, there's a lot of different options for formatting, and if you don't specify the format, it's not going to be in a very good form. So by default, a lot of these save in a report format. You get page numbers, you get other things nice for a print, but you can't run it through your processor very well. So CSV is preferred. CSVs are universal. It's very easy to process. So you're to select that when you set up this file. Another thing you need to set up is append to the file. That's that we don't want to collect this file every day, or we don't want to collect a file for every day for every system. We want one file to grow until we collect it, and delete it, and start it recreating itself. So setting to append is an important way to control that, limit the number of files. Talked about that. Okay, so scheduling. So because now we've got 2 reports that are scheduled. We talked about a little bit about this before. It's really important to coordinate time to run. So we have a collection. It takes a certain amount of time to get all that data off these networks and get it into the server. And if you run this report too soon, and you try to pull it from here, hasn't had time to make it here, then you get an incomplete SCSV. So the solution to that is to just allow enough time to pass when you schedule this report to here.
What are typical timelines?
The rule of thumb, I'd say 2 hours, a 2-hour difference. So if it's 1 a.m., this is now 3 a.m. And that's true for really big systems. Smaller the system, the smaller number of trends, the less time it really takes. You're still saving that. One thing that we had skipped over quite a bit in the past, but is an important consideration, is that you don't have to save the file on that computer, on the server. If the computer is connected to the internet and it has an email properly configured on it, you email the files directly. Doesn't mean that someone has to collect those files. They still have to get individual files and they'll upload them. It saves some trouble if it's hard to get logged into the computer. It's impossible to send trends directly to a folder that you can actually automate a process for getting into Skype. So it's an option to just think about. I'm not going to cover any more about that.
You have to make file size is appropriate for the email too, I'm sure.
Yeah. But if you run every day, they're not too bad. Collected after a week, they're usually about 30 megs. They get pretty big. And if you come back 6 months later, you're off into the gig or so. I'm going to talk a little bit about verification. So how do you know that the trends are working? You know that you set up all the trends that were needed for the project. And say you request it from someone else. they set up all your trends. Oh, sorry. A couple things you can do. The best way, though, is to go back to your trend status worksheet. So they should have documented what was set up and what was requested, right? Now you've got a spreadsheet that you can compare it to. If this is making its way into SkySpark, well, back up for a second. What I recommend to do is to not spend a huge amount of time on verification. You're going to get the most value out of getting most trends and know that it's never going to be perfect. But there are certain trends that are really, really important. And there are a few ways that you can verify things efficiently. And so I wanted to quickly cover some points and some recommendations for that. One is I'd recommend starting from the top and working backward. So if you get to your end goal, if you get a trend in SkySpark, you don't need to look anywhere else. It's doing what it needs to do. If you start at the bottom and you did the trend set up, was it assigned to a report, you still know that it's making its way to the end. So you have to go through every step to verify that it's working correctly. So over at the top, end goal is SkySpark. That's the first place I'd look to see whether or not we got the trend that we asked for. And in SkySpark, I would look at there's a few pieces of information per point. One is how many records of history are there. I can't remember for that tag, but I think it's his samples or his count. So that, first of all, if you have any samples of data, if that's zero or if it's really small, you're probably not getting that data in there correctly. You might also see in SkySpark that there was a sync error that correctly pulled that data from TDM. So now you've narrowed down your list to a smaller portion of trends that aren't working correctly, and you can go a step back, right?
Just add something.
Yeah.
If you're one setting up trends, a really important part of this conversation is just to back a little bit, is this worksheet. That as the person who has a task, we want you to put your initials in the appropriate place. So if you use a trender, then please initial to show that you did do that. I mean, some level, there's this level of verification you're talking about that's like super intense, but there's also the like, I did this task, I'm gonna write in here, and that way we all know who to go to and talk to if there were errors, and it's okay if there are, but it just helps keep everything straight. And the other thing is, when you do pull the trends, there is a place also for you to document, right here, to little X's. Do we put X or do we put initials here? I think X's.
Initials, but
Maybe initials, I can't remember. Initials probably makes more sense.
I don't think that one is being used very regularly. Definitely support what April's saying. It's a really useful tool. There's been a lot of thought to make sure that people are documenting information. It's really come back to. So we do have 5 different trend data detail reports, and you search through each one point at a time to look for something. It might tell you where the person who set up the trends intended to put it. So you first look at it instead of 5. It also tells you, we've got a field for the person who did it. You can ask them questions. Date trended, when it was originally set up, when we can expect it to start collecting, and also times the reports are scheduled. You might see that something was intended to run at 3 a.m. We can go back and quickly find that if it's still running at 3 a.m. Echo that, I'd say use the tool. It makes a lot of sense. It's really helpful. Only thing I'd say is it's really easy to just drag and drop to the bottom. I let a lot, and what happens is it loses value. So, and you don't really think about which points were selected. Did you really set up trends for all these points? And you drag it to the bottom. You might have data in there that's not real, and you still have missing data and have to verify it.
Right. Diligent use of this tool is very helpful.
Yeah.
For the trends forever.
And I'll let you define what diligent use is. I'd say, again, I wouldn't recommend too much emphasis on this. We don't want to spend a huge portion of the budget for a project on trends themselves. So there's sort of acceptable level of verification, and that's kind of a hard call, but it's not perfect. Bit about SkySpark. If you move down to TDM, I'm assuming it's coming from TDM to SkySpark. The tools you could do is to export trends for a day, and could do a diff from this and say count if the name matches, and you might see something like 24 samples. You might see some zeros. You might see some fives. If you have 5, then you know it only collected part of the day. You see a 0, it's not in there. So finally, you again narrow down your list of problems. You move back one more step. Go back to the raw CSV file and make sure for this point name, is it in this file at all? I assume there is a file because we had other data. Any data at all, maybe that's still missing. But sometimes you see when you look in that report is that it did actually try to get a point, but there's no data. So it didn't narrow down your results. Going forward even further, if you go back to scheduler, make sure both these reports are scheduled, coordinated, and that trend data detail report has all the files that are important as we've already discussed. And then the trend collection report is really pulling it off that panel. So I just list 2 more on this, but this is the order that I'd recommend going backward. Try to be most efficient about this. Find the trend definition editor. So if you really do want to look at was that trend set up at all, is it on the panel? You can go back to that original place where that wizard is. The wizard, you can open up one at a time. Or you could even run a trend summary report. That tells you everything that's set up, but it doesn't quite give you enough information about whether it's collecting. And then one more complication as the last step I had here that Todd and Jim ran into. You may not be able to, all of them might be set up correctly, and the problem is that the point no longer exists. TMC, they're making major retrofits to the control system, and you change points. And so even though it was requested, it existed at one time, you're not going to get that data. So that'd be a little more difficult to troubleshoot, but one of the ways you can see that is that you search for that point itself, like a pound point log report or a point definition report. Really good stuff. Yeah, this is perfect. I'm right at zonal scheduling. Minutes were my scheduled time. So let's dig in.
Much better. You're up.